All right, everyone. So the first question I have today is something that's been bugging me for a long time. I recently came to the conclusion that my least favorite class in D&D 5th edition is the Paladin. Part of it is because just the narrative around it doesn't quite make sense to me. So I'm looking for some help from the DM Roundtable today. How do you make Paladin oaths make sense and come to life in your world building? And part of the reason I ask this is, why doesn't just everyone have powers? If it's just like your conviction or your virtue in some way, everyone's got some virtue or ability to cling on to some, what I would call an oath. With that forward out of the way, to kind of explain why I'm asking the question, can we go with Wally first? What do you think about this one?
We can go with Wally first. That's fine.
Let's do it.
Because Jordan, I just want to let you know that I am not here for you on this one. And after you explain what you wanted from me, I'm really not here for you on this one because I don't really have a lot with world building on paladins. Now, clerics, I definitely do. I build out all my deities and things like that. And if a character is playing a warlock, I'll go and I'll take care of the patron. But for me, paladins are like the oaths are the same with the traditions for a monk. I really don't put a lot of thought into them. Now, with that being said, if a player wanted to role play and when they become third level, because I believe that's when they get their sacred oath, and if they wanted this to be a big deal or part of their story or something along that line, then that player and I would probably deep dive into this and we would figure things out. Who's the ranking, the hierarchy, if you will, what the oath is, how long it's been around, and we would probably world build that together with what they had in mind. Other than that, I'm really not going to build it out much further. And I think a lot of it has to do with players, well, at least the players that I've had in my games that have played paladins, they just want the stats. When they go to third level, they're looking and seeing what they're going to get. A lot of them aren't looking at the oaths and like, oh, okay, this is what I have to do. I have to have vengeance or something like that. They're just like, oh, cool. I get this ability. I get this ability. I get this ability. But again, if they were to come to me and we're to build that together, then I think that'd be a lot of fun. So I'm interested in this conversation. So I'm going to pass it off to everybody else. And who knows, Jordan, maybe you and I are both going to learn a lot today.
Well, I think, and I can't speak for everyone, but I have a feeling everyone feels probably the same as me in general, in that it goes by the player. So if you have a player who's role playing very heavily and they want to take the oath seriously, then you as the DM have to take it very seriously. If you have someone who's just looking to build their stats, you don't treat it as harshly. But what I like to do, if a player is doing that, once they select their oath, if they're breaking their oath or they're acting in a way that's not consistent with their oath, I will punish them, and I try to make it in as fun a way as possible, but I start to give them a chance of spell failure, something to make them take their oath a little seriously as their character should, even if they're not the strongest role player. If they're going to select the oath, I still feel like they should live up to it. To me, it's almost like a more advanced form of choosing alignment in a sense, right? It's supposed to dictate your behavior. So I do want it, even for a stat gamer, to affect their behavior because it's a role-playing game. You have to play it a little bit, at least in my opinion. So if they don't follow it, I do want to mete out some minor punishment, but fun, something that's fun, because in the end, we're all just trying to have fun anyway. So you have to balance, not want to punish someone too harshly.
And that's kind of the trick, right? Because really the only support that at least the 5th edition system gives is if they break it, let's make them an Oathbreaker Paladin. And I'm like, that doesn't feel right to me. Maybe more in the micro moments it's affecting their oath and not like completely just like changing their class or taking away their powers. That can be a more tempered way to deal with it.
I hate paladins. This is the reason why, by the way, that I think why Fred got me on this channel, because I'm opinionated. I am not a fan of this this kind of parsing off of spell casting to a bunch of different classes. In my settings, I generally like, if you're a wizard, you're a cleric, those are your spellcasting classes. I mean, when somebody goes into going, I want to be a spellcasting ranger, or I want to be a spellcasting paladin, I'm like, you're just kind of half-assing it. Be something, or be, And so the paladins also, the issue I have with paladins, same issue I have with clerics, in the fact that I generally endorse an agnostic setting, which means I generally, with Amethyst, which is part of my plug, my setting that I develop, gods are entirely act of faith. There's no proof of God in my settings, and I generally kind of enforce that even when I'm playing in an official setting. So when you have a paladin, which traditionally came off of his faith, I always thought that a little wishy-washy. Back when I did my D20 Amethyst in 2008, I want to reconceptualize a lot of these core classes, and one of the things I did back in the D20 Amethyst back in 2008, which I'd like to address again, is that a paladin got his power through complete ego. Like, it's entirely their own arrogance and all the things that we hate about paladins growing up, let's turn that into a superpower. You know, the fact that they have traditionally been some of the most annoying characters, basically in the old days, because they were all lawful good and they all have to follow a certain thing, and they had this massive punishment. I like the idea of leaning in on that. And if I was to make a paladin, I would make a variation of fighter that could tap into some ethereal magic that's undefined. And in Amethyst, for example, you can be an atheist cleric. So that's how I would do it. As for breaking oaths, when I actually had contributing writers, one of them wanted to create a massive 4-page system of checks and balances on what happens when paladins break their oaths and what they should do and the questing they have to do to reclaim it. I'm like, dude, no one is gonna care about 4 pages of rules of what happens when you stop being a useful character. Everyone's gonna do everything in their power to avoid that. Yeah, me and paladins, we have a love-hate relationship, and it's one of the things I'm looking forward to trying a way of reconceptualizing and readdressing it. But as for players breaking their oaths, if I'm in a player and I'm with another paladin, I could really care less what his personal interests are. If I'm a GM, I generally would try to encourage them to play something else. If they really want to do a paladin, and I'm in a setting that allows it, it's depending on what the player wants. If the player wants to dive into their oaths as a character point, sure. If they don't, sure. It's not as important to me. But like I said, for me, I think the paladin as a whole, I've always wanted to lean them away from their spellcasting ability and push them more into their fighting ability. The same with ranger. And I think magic spellcasting should be stuck with wizards and warlocks. But that's my complete unpopular opinion that no one is going to agree with.
I don't think I'm too far off, so at least I'm with you. I'm trying to wrap my head around paladin, so I appreciate hearing your perspective.
Well, my setting, it's in the real earth, so if I say gods are real, then I have to acknowledge that Abrahamic or Jewish or Indian faiths are real, and that creates a very complex little tapestry that I may not want to brush on. So I made a point of saying, no, religion is still faith. Gods are still a matter of faith. Gods are still unproven. I think it should be if you're doing a real earth setting.
I personally love paladins, but that's only me. My players hate them. I think out of the dozen campaigns I've run, I've had 2 paladins total. The one I remember best was also a werebear and an Aasimar. So she would run around the battlefield as a bipedal bear with wings, wielding a giant moon axe, smiting everything in sight. It was epic every single combat. So paladins can be awesome, especially when they have something to fight. As far as oaths go, I agree with what's already been said. It's entirely up to the player, and I will just go with whatever they feel like committing to. If they break an oath, they would do that on purpose as part of like an in-character decision. And from there, we would decide, what are the consequences of this? How much power is going to be taken away so that you're not completely useless in combat? In my world, since my players don't really play paladins that often, I make them each individually a champion of whatever god they're devoted to, instead of having full orders with static oaths that you can choose to take or not take.
Paladin oaths, I don't have a problem with there being different paladin oaths. It makes sense. And as for making it come alive, well, I'm not going to do that. That's the player's job. I know that most of the players that have ever played a paladin have generally been looking more at the powers rather than the tenets. The oaths have tenets, right? That annoys me a little bit because there's a few people who are like, now that I've selected my oath, how do I break it so I can be an oath breaker? And I'm like, no, if that's what if your real goal is to play the oath breaker from the Dungeon Master Guide, you're out of luck. I'm not impressed at all. I'll tell you what we'll do. If that's what your intention is, go make another character, and I'll take your character and lock him in prison. Or he will be struck down by your god and vaporized, and we'll just get it done the easy way. I'm jesting to a large degree, but I'm fine with different gods having different oaths, and so that you have a little bit of variety in terms of the kind of paladin you have. Generally what I do is if there's a player playing a cleric or a paladin and they want to communicate with their god, rather than going through the rigmarole of those garbage spells that exist in 5e, I will let them do that. It won't be like I can call up the god every single minute, because that's just not going to happen. But there is some sort of communication likely to happen that they can engage in. And it might not be a direct conversation. That might be like signs might be left. But I'm happy to do that. I actually did a video on talking to gods, and I think it's something that actually makes a lot of sense for certain classes, like to allow them to have a better communication line, because in 5e, it seems to be being left primarily to the dungeon master and the player to figure out, which is fine. But we've got to say it. It's left obviously for those individuals to figure it out, because the rules aren't going to do it. I think the tenets and the oaths are actually the best part of the paladin. I think the rest of it is pretty garbage, frankly. I think my biggest problems have always been there's one person who still struggles in our group with paladins. Lawful good. They cannot get their head past, you can't be a paladin unless you're lawful good. And we've tried to explain to them multiple times about this. Frankly, my feeling is with a lot of the classes in Dungeons and Dragons 5e, outside of the spellcasters, like the ranger and the paladin in particular, which are like half casters, I would much prefer they got rid of this nonsense with the spell casting, and they just gave them features or things that they could do that they could just do all the time. One of the things I love about the ranger is their favored terrain and their favored enemy. I mean, even though it's not written particularly well, it's always working. Like, just give them things that if it's going to be too powerful, then tone it down and just let them use it all the time, rather than it be a thing that you could track. Do you know what I mean? Like, why is it wearing out? Are we really insisting on everything having a resource management component to it? I understand that around combat, but then again, get rid of that nonsense and I'd be happier. I don't know, does that answer your question?
I think we're circling around answering my question. I've got a lot of ideas for the world building of it, but I think we're definitely adequately saying, like, what does the paladin class do to a group and a DM, and what's the player's role, and that's great.
You know, it's funny, saying you were kind of circle around the topic. I feel like I'm going to kind of bring it full circle from where you started, saying like, well, if we instead based paladins on like their belief in something, like why isn't everybody a paladin? I lean heavily into that idea, instead of paladins being holy champions. This is kind of my own headcanon, that they are just warriors so strongly dedicated to certain certain causes that gods acknowledge them, and they're like, well, I'm gonna kind of sponsor you, kind of putting them even more closer in relation to warlocks than to clerics. And I mean, that belief just has to be, so much that they are like willing to die for it almost every second of their existence. Like, they are basically embodiments of this ideal. And I think part of this canon for me is that the source of power isn't actually from the god. They manifest it within themselves first. There's that spark of belief that somehow taps into the ether and draws ambient divine energy within them. And that's kind of how I like to envision, level 1. It's like they are mighty warriors, and eventually this conviction gives them a little bit of magic. And then 3rd level, a god's like, okay, I'm willing to sponsor you. Sure, why not? These first instances in this history I'm developing in my head, it's like, yeah, these warriors of conviction made oaths with these gods, which then propelled them to much greater powers. And then these individuals, in my own setting, paladins are most likely, amongst all the classes, to become demigods or cultural deities. And then paladin orders kind of spring up after those initial paladins. They're like, well, they lived in a certain way. Could that be replicated? So this is how religion happens. This is a certain way of living. We want to model that in a fantasy setting. Maybe some people are like, maybe we could become gods, but highly unlikely. I would treat any non-strongly believing paladin as like a false paladin. They're basically just a cleric who's just been gifted some divine spark. It is these true paladins that I think are big movers in settings, and they are the originators of their own magic. Oaths are more of a formality for these religions that get started, but it is the one oath that starts a paladin onto their path to godhood.
Yeah, that really gets at the heart of what I'm going for. Wally's applauding you. I'm with you, Denny. I latch onto the same way. And when you said they're more like warlocks than clerics, that's so much how I feel. Here are some ideas that I have to kind of back this up. When I think of paladins, the original paladin in my life that I saw was when I played Baldur's Gate 2, and there was a very good, powerful NPC to join the party named Keldorn, and he was really good to have. Whenever I played through the game, I always got him because I needed him to get through the Beholder Caves because he'd like reflect all their stuff back because of some like heirloom he had. He was part of an order, I think, of the Radiant Heart, I think it was. And so that's another thing is like paladins, when players make characters that are paladins, they rarely are part of like an order or group. Like to me, paladin should have like a built-in faction of people like who have the same ideals because you kind of keep each other in line. And I also think there should be a degree of like ritual to it where maybe you are, because of your oath, how you've shown that you can kind of attune to a tenant of the universe or like a virtue, which maybe a god is giving you power. Maybe they don't even know they're giving you power. The god doesn't even notice, but you just kind of get the scraps from their table by resonating with that god through your works and whatever. And so maybe the order itself has some ritual they do and some ancient artifact where they can bless you with power, kind of like a warlock. And I think those sorts of things would be great. You know, like you can grow in the ranks by your deeds. There'll be conflicts with your family life, you know, just like religious orders in the real world. Keldorn in Baldur's Gate 2, part of his main quest was he wanted to become like a true knight or something like that. And then he found out because he was away being a paladin so much that his kid saw this other guy as his dad because he was always around sleeping with Keldorn's wife. And that was like, this thing is he went to confront them. And you as the main character, he looks to you like, what should I do? And you have to either be like, kick his butt, Keldorn, kill him, or no, choose the path of righteousness. And like, you know, like, so that you kind of like aim how he's going to decide. But I think paladins should have those kind of dilemmas that are like a conflict between their goals and their order and their tasks, their tenets. This was really well realized in the recent Critical Role thing, the Exandria Unlimited Calamity, where there was the Paladin of Redemption, who was based on not having a god, but being not getting power from a god, but getting power from an oath to the people, and they collectively gave him power, just like the mantle of that. I'm kind of just throwing out all these ideas because I think about this a lot, and I really want to make paladins come to life. I don't like how they mechanically function, but I at least want them to feel cool in the world. I agree, as some have said, that like it really is the players that drive this thing, how much you're going to get out of a paladin oath. But at the same time, I'd love to have a DM who's really savvy on this to kind of set up the player for these things, you know, give them that heirloom that's kind of like Thor's Mjolnir, where once in a while when they've done something horrible, they can pick it up and say, I'm still worthy, you know, that sort of like role-playing moment. And that's what I would love to see. And I like the ideas of what happens when they break the oath, when they're faltering, like Greg said, like there's certain things that will happen. And so all these ideas, wrap it up into one. Hopefully this discussion helped some people figure out paladins a little bit more, or inspire them to do a little bit more with them.
I like what you said there at the end, as far as, you know, as a DM wanting to create that. And I think you can. I mean, I said earlier, and a lot of us said earlier, that, you know, it is more up to the players. But maybe the players that are playing paladins have never had that experience with creating their backstories, or why they're doing this oath, or, you know, developing their own story, if you will. So I think if like in your case, Jordan, for a DM that's passionate about doing like patrons for warlocks or DDs for clerics, and if you want to dig into the oaths for paladins, I say go for it. I mean, make it up, and, you know, the player might really, really appreciate it that you put that time into that, and they'll find it interesting because they might not have had some paths or some quests of their own, or goals, if you will. And then you including, you know, maybe these ancient dark rituals, you know, maybe a book shows up one night that they were, whoever brought it to them or something. I mean, there's all kinds of different story hooks as a DM. So I really like your idea too, that it's still okay for the DM to take the initiative and see if that might be something that they can build on and include, and maybe the player that's playing the paladin will like it.
Yeah, I'm glad you like that, Wally. And you make a good point that sometimes the DM kind of leads new players or people who haven't given a lot of thought to how to play a paladin. They just thought it sounded cool. You can kind of take them by the hand and give them a few little breadcrumbs, and then they can build from there. Or maybe you just really like running for paladins, so you're just going for it, gung-ho. And I think part of it should also be like the fighter in the party. You know, why aren't they a paladin? They might think like, oh, I may be a skilled warrior, but I could never take on the oath or pursue that kind of virtue. I feel like I would fall short and damn my soul to the hag's gas station in hell, as Fred once brought up. That should be a thing, is like, why isn't the fighter a paladin, you know? And I think that could be a fun way to roleplay and explore the world.
If I can chime in on that. Well, I think going to what you're just saying about what defines a paladin, because that's actually a conversation a lot of people have, is that what defines it. Like, you can go as a ranger and you could go total Aragon without any spellcasting abilities and still kind of have a definition of what people would recognize as a ranger. But paladin's always been an interesting one, because you look at it and go outside of what we define it as people who play D&D. If you ask a layman, if you go to ranger, they go, oh yeah, Aragorn from Lord of the Rings. You go, who's a paladin? And they're like, what do you mean? What's a paladin? Like, outside of our tropes for D&D, there's not much of a definition. Like, what defines? Is it his faith? Is that dedication? Once again, that brings up about how much do you want that faith, that religion, that God to be part of your story. I always found it interesting that's in many ways, the cleric comes off as less fanatical than paladins. Some people take that misinterpretation of paladins thinking, oh, I'm a zealot. And do you want a zealot in your game? So I think there's more than, if anyone, someone in the game wants to be a rogue, a fighter, a wizard, there's not much of a conversation. If somebody in my game wants to be a paladin, I need to sit them down and go, okay, what paladin do you want to play? Because it's a very large interpretation, right? Someone has a paladin, I could be battling with this person's ego for the rest of the game, or somebody who's just basically a fighter with some diplomacy skills. Because sometimes you wonder, is a fighter just a grunt, and is paladin something more? Is he a flag bearer, perhaps? Is he like the knights? He has a code, but there's nothing magical about him. You know, that's the thing, was that how do you define paladin? Which has always been a problem I've had, which is the reason why I've always had issues with the class, because, you know, outside of what we know as D&D, there's not really a fantasy definition of what a paladin is accepted as.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that ambiguity is kind of what's made me uncomfortable, and I don't feel like a lot of people talk about it and say, like, how do I run a paladin in my game? You could even simplify it. You could say a paladin is just a cleric who is imbued with strength in their arm rather in their spell casting, and their, instead of the spell casting being outward like clerics tend to do, maybe it's more inward and it gushes out in the form of an aura. You could just say, like, it's just a type of cleric, you know? Like, you could go that route if you want. There's so many ways you could go about it, and I think every DM should just think, what is a paladin in my setting? Or what do the players want to make of it when they want to play a paladin? It's an important thing to explore.
I think a lot of these kind of, questions begin to resolve themselves if, you just have a conversation with your player after they pick their class. It's like, well, what do you want this to mean? Regardless of what class it is, if you're playing a rogue, what's your relationship to the law? Are you starting out? Are you established? Do you have a faction? Like you pointed out that paladins basically have a built-in faction. We can absolutely do that with every class. It just takes some collaboration and some one-on-one to, no matter what character you're trying to make, really make them feel alive in a setting.
Absolutely. Have that conversation with your players, everybody, and think, how are you going to bring this to life? Let's not just assume we're all talking about the same thing, and I think you'll do just fine.